Oh, Philip, you were so young and naive and stupid. If only you knew you'd become a teacher, alone and friendless. Hi everyone, so we're going to talk about Hide and Seek by Vernon Scannell. Make sure you've read the poem before you continue with this video, so pause it now if you need to. Well, if you've read it, you know that the basic summary of the poem is it's a nostalgic memory of playing a game in childhood, specifically hide and seek. To develop it a little bit, the child hides, the friends can't find him, he thinks he's won, he steps out and finds he's all alone. This is a narrative poem with an unhappy ending. And also because it's a modern poem, it's also in free verse. Most modern poems are often in free verse, and perhaps the free verse there reflects the chaos of childhood or the chaotic nature of memory. It's also just one stanza long. Perhaps that reflects how memories often appear as one single lump, one moment in time. It's a whole complete memory. And also, I think it reflects how nostalgic memories can be both happy and sad at the same time. You might want to compare that to piano and how in piano the memory is both happy and sad. Also, whilst it is in free verse, which usually means it doesn't follow any rules, there are a few rhyming couplets in the first 80% of the poem. The rhyming couplets perhaps hint towards the childish voice that comes through. It has a nursery rhyme feel and perhaps reflects that innocence of childhood, not knowing about loss until the very end. So those rhymes, you've got out and shout, door and before, lane and again, coat and throat. Okay, let's talk about the key structural features, because I think this poem is really interesting to talk about. So the most interesting part of the structure to this poem is that the poetic persona is the narrator, and he is talking in the second person. He's talking to the child. For example, you can see, they'll never find you in the salty dark. He's also giving commands, reminding him of the instructions of hide and seek. You mustn't sneeze. And to me, this suggests the older persona is commenting on events of his memory, and I think we do this a lot. We often think back to previous events and sometimes commentate on what happened. Now, we mentioned earlier with the form that it reflects the innocence of childhood, and that I get a sense that the older person is a little bit critical of his younger self. For example, when he says you're very clever, you think you're very clever, they must be thinking that you're very clever. I just get a sense that the older poetic persona is criticizing his younger self for being so arrogant to think that he's being very, very clever, because there's a bit of a disaster to follow from this game when he steps out and finds that he's all alone. It suggests that our nostalgic memories can be uncomfortable, and also we can admit that sometimes we're a bit stupid when we're younger. We also begin the poem with lots of short sentences, enjambment and exclamation marks. These all raise the tension and the excitement that accompanies childish memories, the innocent excitement of childhood. The enjambment for the poem starts about here, but even early on it's also broken up with caesura, in which the lines are broken up by elements of punctuation. Again, simply the chaotic nature of childhood, the chaotic nature of memories. You have building tension through the poem, exemplified by don't breathe, don't move, stay dumb, the short sentences and caesura, foreshadowing the loss that's about to come. And it culminates in a climax where the child thinks they've won, but it's an unhappy climax because it's reflective of the false hopes of childhood. And the story finishes with its falling action after the climax, with a negative lexical field reflecting loss and loneliness. Negative lexical field like the adjective darkening. Nothing. And also the metaphor, the sun is gone. Keyword there being sun, its connotations of lightness, brightness, possibly even innocence as well, the innocence of childhood. It's all gone. And that links fairly smoothly into some of the language features, the first of which are the lexical fields or the imagery at the beginning and the end of the poem. It begins very positive, ends very negative. For example, the poet uses the sense of smell to describe the smell of the seaside, and further uses sibilants in that line. The sacks in this tall shed smell like the seaside. You can almost hear the sea. That sibilant's adding to the powerful nature of memory. Those positive senses begin to turn to negative ones. The sensation of touch, your legs are stiff and the cold bites. And also the smell, the dark, damp smell of the sand moves in your throat. You've also got an example of alliteration there with the dark, damp smell. That alliteration, the d sound, is also negative. It sounds negative. Those negative sounds foreshadowing the ultimate loss at the end of the poem, and reflecting the sense of loss overall. Another thing to point out is that the language, the vocabulary used overall is fairly childish. There aren't any particularly difficult words in there, and I think that's the older narrator talking to the child, so the child understands the voice, and it links to the form, because although the language itself is understandable, the content is quite adult in its nature, using metaphors like the sun is gone to represent loss. A child wouldn't immediately understand that, but the adult does, and it's for that reason why I think it's an older version of the child looking back nostalgically on this memory. In terms of themes, the big one obviously is nostalgia. Here it's reminding us that memories can be both happy and sad. Also that memories stay with you well into old age. They can even influence us today. Perhaps the narrator is feeling that loss today that is reflected in his childhood experiences. Also, there's that sense of being critical of our childishness, and they must be thinking that you're very clever. If you were to compare that with something like Piano, there's no sense of the poet being critical of the child for having childish ways. In fact, in Piano, the poet feels an empathetic sympathy for the innocent love the child has for the mother. You've also got the theme of childhood. Childhood is innocent, but it also, in its innocent way, reflects adult life. For example, we've all been somewhere or done something where we think we're successful, but ultimately it turns out we're not. Perhaps also we can imagine that in older life we might not have the sorts of friendships we did in childhood. Perhaps this narrator is feeling loneliness, and that sense of loneliness perhaps was born in moments like this back in his childhood. The poem also links with the theme of identity, in the sense that you are your childhood memories affect who you are today, and also to be who you are, you need your friends, your community, to be able to avoid loss. There's that question at the end, full of regret, but where are those who sought you? In terms of the poet, Vernon Scannell was somebody who fought in World War II. He even fought on the D-Day landings, and perhaps this poem reflects how he misses his brothers in arms, the men that he fought with on the D-Day landings. He's looking back to his memories, and perhaps this simple game of hide and seek reflects the loss that he felt following war. War is often metaphorically compared to a game, and this is a game in which the child has lost his friends, and maybe that also reflects the loss of his friends during the war. And finally, what poems compare well or easily with hide and seek? Well, it depends on what theme the question is based on, but if it was innocence of childhood, You can compare it with Prayer Before Birth, the poem about told from the perspective of a child before they're born, or Half Past Two, the one where the child can't tell the time and is worried. If the question is about identity or community, you could think of comparing it with Search for My Tongue, the poem about losing one's identity through language, or the poem Remember, particularly with the need for others, the need to be in the thoughts of other people. And finally, if the question is about nostalgia or memory, then an easy one is Piano, in which the narrator remembers a fond memory of his mother playing the piano. So how would you write about this poem? Well, let's take an example if you were writing about identity. The main point or idea that the poet's trying to get across about identity here is that you are your childhood. The things that you remember about your childhood affect you in your adult life. When it comes to talking about how the poet uses form to do that, well, you could say that the poetic persona is talking in the second person and reliving their memory of childhood. You go on and comment about the things that the poet reveals about their childhood and how that affects them in their current life. That idea about how you can lose things as a child reflects how you lose things as an adult, how childhood was important when friendship was important when you were a child, and it's important when you're an adult. Then if you were going to say something about structure and identity and how you are your childhood, that loss of rhyming couplets at the end of the poem suggests or equates to the loss of innocence as you become an adult. That loss of just that little element of rhyming couplets into that pure free verse suggests the chaos, the chaos of adult life. When talking about the language, I think I would change my point when talking about identity. Here, I think the language suggests that perhaps you need friendship to be who you are, and this is reflected in the negative lexical field at the end of the poem. The adjective darkening, the metaphor sun is gone, the loss of light, and so on. Without friends, you live in a dark world. Remember, in the exam, you need to talk about form, structure, and language for the poem and compare the way another poem has also used form, structure, and language to get ideas across. For example, if you were comparing the language used in Piano, he's not talking about needing friendship, but more about needing motherly love. And you could talk about the language used to show his mother in a beautiful light, and how remembering his mother positively is an important part of his identity.